Hi, this is Mike Weaver, one of the product owners here at Quadratech, and one of the products I oversee is Cloud Commander. Today we're going to talk about mailbox permissions and how it relates to Cloud Commander projects. On today's agenda, we're going to talk about the three types of mailbox permissions. We're going to review what are delegates and what we mean by that when we say what are delegates, why migrate permissions and what are the risks, and how to migrate permissions with Cloud Commander. We talk about the three types of mailbox permissions. They kind of intertwine and build on each other. If you imagine this green box is the entire mailbox inside Exchange, we then have different levels of permissions that are more granular inside of it. So for example, if somebody has full mailbox permissions, they have a lot of these access levels that are below. Delegates can be a little special. When we talk about full mailbox permissions, though, these are permissions that are defined and set by the administrator. These are done in the Exchange Admin Center. It could have been done in Active Directory back in a certain version back in the day, but these are full mailbox permissions that allow somebody at the actual full mailbox level to do some various things. Read-only access, full mailbox permissions, whatever it may be. There's also very special levels that are available too, and sometimes those are assigned to service accounts for very specific needs. A lot of times service accounts are in this level as well so that they can do certain functions, whether that's a backup account back when we used to be on-prem and back these things up, or maybe it's a member of your compliance team so they can go in and do their activities as a compliance officer. Whatever that may be, that is done at that level. We talk about delegate permissions. These permissions can be set by the administrator in the admin center, or it can be set by the user themselves inside Outlook. This is usually other users that are defined. So this is most commonly somebody who has an administrative assistant that is managing an aspect of their mailbox, and that is being delegated down to them, or maybe delegated. Somebody goes on a vacation, so they'll delegate mailbox rights while they're out, or somebody's out on long-term leave and they delegate a bunch of items down just because that sometimes it's easier to do it that way as the end user. It can include calendar processing, access, and some other settings that we'll talk about in a minute here. And then we have folder level permissions. These are typically set by the user as well. An administrator could open the mailbox and set them, but again, more commonly, this is done by the end user. The most common piece are calendars, setting calendar level permissions to maybe my team could see my calendar, but not the entire org, things like that. Or again, inbox. I go on vacation and I give my boss access to my inbox so they can see and read what's coming in, potentially take a message and action it as needed, or the ability to add tasks or other custom folders that might be in the mailbox. For example, I may file items into a folder and then the person on my team can see that folder. When we talk about delegates, delegates are special. This is really designed for that situation where I have somebody supporting me and taking care of my calendar. So here's an example screenshot that shows that. One of the really cool aspects of it is calendar processing. And that allows me to, whenever I get a calendar invite, it actually goes to an administrative assistant so that that person can manage my calendar. So they approve and deny my requests and handle that aspect of managing the person's calendar. So that is really really the most common piece of delegates, but you can do other levels here, as you can see here, and delegate other pieces. You can also say private items or not private items. So, if you've marked things as private, you can define which delegates can see those private items and which delegates cannot. Talk about folder level permissions. The first screenshot on the left is just right clicking on inbox and seeing permissions. And as you can see, you can define these custom levels. And the number one thing is default. So what is the default level of permission? So I could give my entire org certain aspects to my mailbox. It's more commonly used in the calendar and not your inbox. You probably don't want to give the whole company access to delete your items or things like that. More commonly, this is folder level permissions for the calendar. And in the last few versions of Outlook and Exchange, we've seen this automated process where you can share your calendar or request that somebody share their calendar with you. And then again, on the right side, if I shared this with one person, they would immediately show up in my calendar properties where I can remove them or change their level of access. There's canned levels and then there's custom levels. So you can use a reviewer option, and that comes with a set of rights, or you can customize it as well. When we talk in the migration space, a lot of times we get this question of, okay, do you migrate delegates? And what we have to be careful of is when somebody is saying delegates, they mean any of those three mailbox levels that we're talking about more commonly. Every organization handles access differently, so they may handle it specifically. And what's interesting is how organizations handle access typically goes back to the day that they started heavily using Exchange. So if an org has been on Exchange since Exchange 5.5, a lot of times there is a service access request process to grant mailbox rights, and it is handled through that. And that is the only supported method. And there's a security audit event or whatever it may be to keep those up to date. For orgs that are more in the modern versions, then they kind of let the users do it using the delegate feature or giving calendar access or things like that. So what we find is there's inconsistencies in permissions. At the end of the day, when we're migrating mailboxes from one place to the other, we are talking about how are we maintaining the process of users accessing other mailboxes, whatever it may be. So when we're doing a planned migration, we have to talk through all three of these scenarios and figure out what's going to move and what's not. The pros and cons. So obviously the pros of moving permissions is it's consistent, it's easy, users just pick right back up where they were left off, and it's very user friendly. However, there's a lot more in this problem. The cons can be very, very high. So if there is no audit of this information as set by the users, they can be very, very out of date. So you can be migrating these permissions and moving them over. And if you're a highly regulated client, this can be a problem because you could be giving access to information that is not least access. If in the source environment you don't have the auto map feature on and in the target environment you do, this can be a very large problem for shared mailboxes because all the people that have access to that shared mailbox, if those full mailbox permissions are copied over and auto map is on in the target, suddenly they're going to see all those in Outlook on Monday morning, and that creates a problem. And then the permissions have to get cleaned up. People may perceive that there's a data security event, and it can really be difficult. The other con is if you don't move them, it generates help desk volume. Last Friday, I could see this shared mailbox, and now I can't. Last Friday, my admin could see my calendar, and now they can't. So it's a real, data security question about what you do in the situation. When we talk about options, you have a few options. One is you can migrate one set of permissions, but not all of them. So you could say we're going to move full mailbox permissions because those were done through a formal process, but we're not going to migrate folder permissions or calendar permissions. Those the user needs to redo. We're going to do shared mailbox permissions, but we're not going to do anything else, things like that. Another option is you only do VIPs. You might want to do an audit. So I'm only going to do my top 50 execs in the company, but those are always up to date because we do an audit every 3 months on their permissions. That might be an option, and everybody else has to maintain the after migration, and you give them a good document on how to do it. The other option is you don't migrate permissions and say, look, we haven't done a good job of migrating these or managing these over all these years. Now it's time to get them cleaned up. We're going to start fresh in the new environment. Here's the new process to request mailbox access and go from there. For Cloud Commander, we migrate these permissions. You can choose which ones you want to move. So to do this, it uses a mapping table. If you put it in the workflow, it will use this mapping table. And you can pick and choose what you want to migrate. There's a pending blog on our folder permission process, which is launching in early 2020. So that'll give some additional options on what to migrate and what to not. What's important to note is if those mailbox permissions are not mapped, so the source user and the target user are not in the mapping, those permissions are not mapped because we don't know who they go to. Keep in mind when you're migrating users in a tenant-to-tenant migration, even though you may move the UPN over, those are different accounts. They're different SIDs, they're different identifiers, they're unique. So it has to be migrated, those permissions have to be migrated and mapped correctly so that they are migrated correctly. And that's all. That's all on mailbox permissions here at Quadratech for Cloud Commander.